And it feels like there's not enough praise inside of me. With all these words, all my heart can sing is holy. And it feels like there's not enough praise inside of me. With all these words, all my heart can sing is holy. You are holy. Jesus Christ, you bled your love, laid down yourself and gave me life. In naked shame you hung and you were lifted high. Here I lay in awe and wonder. And I am afraid, for no one's ever sacrificed and loved me this way. So on my face I fall under your heavy grace. Here I lay in awe and wonder. Ooh, ooh, and I wonder. I'm in awe of the majesty of who you are. Your love is a seal that's burnt inside my heart. And all of the day I want to be where you are, Holy Father. And it feels like there's not enough praise inside of me. With all these words, all my heart can sing is holy. You are holy. Jesus Christ, you bled your love, laid down yourself and gave me life. Naked shame you hung and you were lifted high. Here I lay in awe and wonder. And I am afraid, for no one's ever sacrificed and loved me this way. So on my face I fall under your heavy grace. Here I lay in awe and wonder. Jesus Christ, you bled your love, laid down yourself and gave me life. Naked shame you hung and you were lifted high. Here I lay in awe and wonder. And I am afraid, for no one's ever sacrificed and loved me this way. So on my face I fall under your heavy grace. Here I lay in awe and wonder. Ooh, ooh. and it feels like there's not enough praise inside of me. With all these words, all my heart can sing is holy. And it feels like there's not enough praise inside of me. With all these words, all my heart can sing is holy. Into the everlasting I reach my hand. Set my eyes on you, I've got to see. Into the everlasting I lean my head, rested on your lap, I'm on my knees. Into the everlasting I reach my hand. Set my eyes on you, I've got to see. Into the everlasting I lean my head, rested on your lap, I'm on my knees. The veil is thin, my senses on fire. Take me into your center as you fill mine. Veil is thin, my senses on fire. Take me into your center as you fill mine. Into the everlasting I reach my hand. Set my eyes on you, I've got to see. Into the everlasting I lean my head, rested on your lap. I'm on my knees.
All right, good deal. Well, good morning. So we can tell it's the second morning and the last morning for several reasons. One is that everybody is just visiting and connecting and casually and slowly coming inside. The other, oh, there it is, good. The other is it's just morning and people get going slowly. So I know we've got folks outside in the coffee shop. We're about to get started. I'm going to introduce Diane here in just a moment. We just want to say welcome again to what God has been doing. It was a good evening last night. We've got a good day planned today. See what God has in store. We're excited about it. Encourage you before I forget it yet again on a couple of things. There are products back there from Streams on the table in the back. Be sure and check that out if there's anything there you need or are interested in. It's always a good time and easy when you're at an event to pick that stuff up. Doesn't have to be done online. Also, we talked to the coffee shop outside, and they have prepared, just so for those of you who may either not have a car, or those of you who may be just not going to be hanging out through lunch, they've got, I think, chicken salad sandwiches and chips and some kind of combo out there that they prepared for us. So if you're hanging out here during lunch, just keep in mind they have some food out there, not just the typical, it's not on display, but not just the typical, Krispy Kreme donuts, which were calling my name this morning. It was really difficult to I know I don't need Krispy Kreme donuts. So I wear one around my waist, and is what happens most of the time. So I managed to avoid them, but they were really calling my name this morning, so for some reason. So they do have some regular food as well. So let's see. We have this afternoon. We have a panel discussion with the board of directors. Questions have been turned in. If you didn't turn in a question or you had a question for the panel, you can still do that. We're not overwhelmed with questions. You can also ask them during the time this afternoon. And I just wanted to be clear on the purpose of that. There are several questions that have been provided to us on things like is vision changing, or what's the vision for the next few years? What do we see in terms of missions and outreach type stuff and things of that nature? But we also are very glad to take questions like, I think one of them was tips and ideas on different types of evangelistical work. If you've got questions, just topics you've been interested in, or spiritual questions you've had. I'm not saying we have all the answers. I'm just saying it's a good time to just open up a discussion of anything that may be on your mind. It's really intended to be an open-ended time of conversation, both about Patria and just about spiritual things in general. So if you had questions or things that you haven't turned in and you want to do that ahead, you're welcome to do that. We'll take the written questions first for sure. Let's see, is there anything else? I'm also trying to just give people time to enter in from the coffee shop area. Oh, badges. You may not need no stinking badges, but we will take your stinking badges back and save them for next year at the end of the day. If you want them for a souvenir, they're so beautiful. If you want them for a souvenir, please feel free to keep them. But if you are going to throw them away, please drop them back at the registration table at the end of the day, and we will recycle them. We will rebuild them, make them better than they were. Do you remember that? Better, stronger, and faster. And it will not cost us $6 million. So I declare my age, knowing that way too well. So I could even do the sound effects, but I won't. Yes, there they were. I heard them in the back. Oh, awesome. Okay, good. Well, it's just, it gets more casual as every session goes, and I get worse with my jokes, so I should really stop here. So we're terribly excited to have Diane Jackson with us this morning. And I just have to tell you, over the years, it's been one of those places where Diane has been an amazing friend and part of our family. The relationship with her and John Paul for so many years, well beyond the time I was even before I first met you, when John Paul was just coming to Birmingham and met my father for the first time. The connection to this family for my family has been monumental, just a tremendous impact on our lives, and not just John Paul, but the connection with Diane as well. And I've watched over the years as Diane has been somewhat, if I can say, in the background of things, yet not really. Because all she's had and poured out and poured in, and in those conversations and seasons and moments of giving and pouring out to others. But it's just been amazing to watch her filled and bubbling over in what she's carrying and ready to release. We're so blessed. We were expecting John Paul in March 5 years ago, and did not get that blessing to have him with us. And so we are today just sort of saying, welcome home, Mom. Because as much as John Paul was a father to the birth of Patria and to myself and the different board members that he was our spiritual father, and many of you and some of you who worked with Streams and knew him as a spiritual father, and some of you who are connected here or have come here because of maybe distant connection to he and his ministry and his family as a spiritual father. We're looking forward to just having that part of our family here with us today. So I'm going to invite Diane Jackson to come and to join us this morning with whatever she has for us. Amen. And let's just bless her this morning. Can we do that? Just reach out your hands. And Father, in the name of Jesus, we thank you for Diane. We thank you for all that she carries. We thank you for all that she has. We thank you for all that she's giving. We thank you for all that she stands for and represents. Would you stir up the gifts of God within her this morning? Would you release through her all that you have put within her to give away? And we thank you, God, that you've allowed us this time together with her. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, I'm known as Little Mama in some people's eyes. So our former assistant's daughter, she'll talk about dreaming of me and wanting to pray for me. So before I came, I told Mandy, I said, tell Shiloh to pray for Little Mama. I'm getting laryngitis and I need my voice to speak next week. Well, yesterday when Matt was sharing, I thought, oh, wow, he's almost like a little segue into some of what I'm sharing today. And I even, listened to some of his phrases and his words, and I said, he speaks my language. Well, the question that I had on my mind starting out was wanting to say, have you ever felt like God is playing hide and seek with you? I've wondered that over the years. But now I've gotten to the place to where I so enjoy seeing how he's working behind the scenes and trying to imagine how he's working behind the scenes. I'm going to get into a picture of my life kind of in the middle of this message, and I kind of call it going down Diane Jackson Lane, and then you'll get a picture of, living with John Paul going down John Paul Jackson Highway. But I want to start off with a really, really fun God story. It happened before Michael invited me. In fact, a short time before you invited me, and you remember I didn't answer you right away. That tends to be how I operate. But one morning, Sunday, I was getting ready for church, and suddenly a song came to my mind, and it was "The Wind Beneath My Wings." Well, over 34 years earlier, someone sang that song over me. John Paul and I were at a church with a large staff, and this young lady was hinting at my support and my role with John Paul, and so I'd never forgotten that. But I don't have that song or play it. But I ended up leaving for church, and I prayed some very specific prayers related to that, and I was asking God about what's it like being under the shadow of your wings, and what exactly does that mean? And well, I know John Paul's got it all figured out now, but what about me? And so I forgot about it, and after church I get a text from my roommate. She's like, "Diane, I think God has something for you today." Well, we have pretty interesting things happen between us. So even though John Paul's gone, it still can be rather fun sometimes. But it was hours later before I was back home, and I headed upstairs, and I could tell something was going on in my roommate's bedroom, and so I left her alone for a while. Suddenly I hear the song playing, "You Are the Wind Beneath My Wings." I thought, oh my goodness. And so I'm getting moved on, and I slowly inch my way towards her bedroom door. It took me a little bit to peek my head in, and there she sat at her laptop, and she told me she didn't select that song. It just happened to come up on an online church service. She said, "I didn't even know they considered that, in the area of a worship song." So I began to remind her of what had happened to me over 34 years ago. And there she sat with tears in her eyes, and she said, "Diane, my angel sang that over me last night." So I headed downstairs. I thought, okay, she needs time to compose. I won't pummel her now with, what did the angel look like? And what was your dream? So when I saw her later downstairs, she began to share. And she had a message for her, which she didn't feel free to share. But then she said, "Diane, my angel told me, and tell Diane to fly." Well, I really didn't think that just meant to come fly to Patria, but I felt like the Lord, and sometimes has a sense of humor with me. And I don't mind that. We all, life is serious enough. I need to laugh sometimes, and so I like thinking of him in that way. But to me, that was like a cheerleader message for, all of you, too. We all need to learn to spread our wings and fly. So now I have to start turning pages of notes because I didn't want to bring my laptop. And by the way, my roommate did say when I asked her about the angel, all she said was, well, the wings were more like glass rather than feathers. So that's pretty much all I found out there. But for years I've heard about, Patria, and, thought, oh, it sounds lovely. A family setting, like a family reunion. But then that causes me to think, well, what does that family word mean to you? We all come back, from different backgrounds. We have different emotions attached to that. But for me, one of the key things is to feel safe. We want to feel safe. And so in my mind, I think, okay, if you don't have a family, if your family is shrinking, or you feel you have a non-supportive family, perhaps a bit lifeless or draining, find your own family. Find a place like Patria where you can connect with other people, share values, and encourage one another and build one another up. Challenge each other, too. I never did any of that with John Paul. Now, some people are harder to connect with, granted. And I've had people say to me, if it just weren't for people, I could really enjoy what I'm doing, or I could really enjoy life. But it doesn't work that way, does it? Even my easygoing brother, just recently I was surprised when he shared with me the attitude he had after living in years of abuse. He said, I absolutely felt I didn't have any need for people. And I could relate to that. But unfortunately, that can transfer to our ability to relate with God as well. But to me, his story was a perfect example of how disappointment in people can cause us to shut everybody out and to shut ourselves down to where it's like, no, I'm not going to mess with that. It's just going to be me, myself, and I. So my advice to you is don't let disappointment, don't let hardship stop you from relating to each other, from finding people who there can be this back and forth exchange. And of course, stick with God. And you will find those who will go the distance with you, and I can vouch for that. Now, especially in the early days of ministry with John Paul and I, he loved the concept of community, people playing and people working together. However, we ended up having to go it alone sometimes, just because of the nature of what God was doing in him. He was known for being a catalyst, no doubt about it. And he loved telling stories, especially God's stories. Of course, that sent people clamoring after him. And he was so naturally good at a lot of things that he juggled a lot of things. Well, part of the things he was encouraged to do was plant churches. And so he did that. And he would see how pastors spoke of wanting to relate more, and leaders, have a connection. So I remember how excited he was at our first board meeting in California, where he had the chalkboard and he was drawing he called it the orbital model of relating together, where we're relating side by side, and, not that he called it that hierarchical type concept. But everything was, we influence through relationship. He was all about that. Well, his time was spread thin, and he soon found he couldn't meet the expectations of people for, drawing and wanting him to do more, drawing things out of him. So I thought, okay, it's time for me to step back. But a seed was planted, wasn't it? And now we have Patria, because of Michael and Elisa. So they picked up, and now they've done something that you're all benefiting from. So to me, Patria is another prime example of not letting disappointments in people and failed expectations stop you from doing the thing that God designed us to do. It's connect and relate and think of others. So I asked people's opinions of what I should share about today. And of course, you're going to hear different things. Okay, what's your story? Okay, what about John Paul? How about, church leader issues and such? And so I thought, okay, I'm a pretty practical gal. So you'll get maybe a interweaving of some and all of that. But I want you to anticipate the hidden God stories behind my words, because Michael limited me on time. And I can either retreat and not talk at all, or I can talk your ear off. Well, when John Paul, left the corporate world and began trying to do what God had shown him and shared with him and inspired him with, he kind of went along the path of full gospel businessmen's meeting, small church speaking opportunities, although I think the radio interviews were in between that. And then he started traveling and going out and meeting more inspiring, motivating, young men. So he connected with Mike Bickle, and we ended up moving to Kansas City. And at Kansas City, Bob Jones hung out there at the time, and so we got to hang out some. So one day we're walking along the back of the gym nonchalantly. I'm wearing my green and white striped t-shirt, and Bob turns to me and he said, "So, you're out of prison now." And of course, somewhere in there you get, "You know what that means, don't you?" And I just didn't answer him. And then it was, "Well, you're going to live in a glass house." Well, I kind of had a feeling of what that meant, and I thought, no, I'm a private person. Don't do that to me. But, we find out in life that if you want to influence people, you want to make an impact on someone's life, you have to be willing to step out of your glass house, your fortress, and you have to reveal who you are. It's not all sunshine and roses. You have to be real with people. Well, you don't have to be, but people need to hear about your delightful time and your not delightful time. You're not a picture of a perfect life and, perfect person. Well, I first became aware of that really early in our ministry days when we were in Dallas, and a well-known prophetic voice, I think even at that time, had a conference, and so we were there as a couple, and he had us stand up, and they didn't have recorders back then, but the one thing I remembered was he said to John Paul, "You will be like David and sound the trumpet." And to me, he said, "And you will be like Abigail." That's all I remember. But I didn't know a thing about Abigail. And I did, see that she played a very definitive role in David's life. But to me, as I read her story and people trying to convey what they felt her life was more in detail, I thought, that woman led a life of turmoil. And I thought, I can relate to that. So I saw her as, even in her husband, as seeing his manhood, but she believed in the role he had, and she was a steadfast support for him. So that part I could relate to as well. So as fulfilling as ministry can be, you probably all discovered we're not exempt from hardships. And lately I've been coining the phrase, you're not even exempt from being bully-proof. Life offers a lot of practice to take up our shield, either as a faith act or almost like self-preservation and self-protection. We are going to take personal hits, but that's when we have to do everything possible to prevent ourselves from getting what we would call spiritual, permanent heart damage. Or our heart gets so crusty that it hinders us from reaching out to people. And of course, things that aren't going to be new to you, I'm not used to this mic, but I see as essential along the way are developing healthy friendships. We need to draw on each other's strength. There's going to be times you have to draw on each other's strength. You need friends when life hurts, and you have to make yourself available. Some friends go, some friends come and stick around for a while, so you have to find the ones who are going to stick with you. Growing in friendship with God, that's obvious, I know. But my background did not make that an easy transition or connection for me. And I've found myself in steps, relating to the Lord, and especially these last 5 years. I was used to people coming and going in my life. They weren't there to fill a steady role. But I've seen the Lord as my loving dad and counselor. He's my best friend, security and companionship, and my favorite, he's my number one cheerleader. He's helped me move forward in the best of times and the worst of times. And sometimes when life really, really hurts, you might feel like you're barely taking a step at a time, not even a day at a time. But then I remind myself of the struggle that Jesus had every step as he walked towards his death. I mean, think about it. He knew the worst possible suffering was ahead of him, and he walked willingly towards that pain. There's not many of us that, would be rah, rah, let's go and do that. And they talk about how, the intense grief can alter your heart muscle. You've heard this before, and cause a broken heart syndrome. Well, he faced that. And so to me, I think those steps he took are something we should be calling, the greatest steps ever taken for mankind, for us. Now, our culture doesn't endorse sitting very much, does it? And I've never been particularly good at long times of sitting myself. But in Psalms, David wrote about sitting at the Lord's right hand. And sometimes you have to take time to do that. I mean, it's good to do that a lot. But there are times when you're going to feel like you almost can't do anything else. You can barely walk, let alone run. And so it's time to just sit with the Lord. Sometimes looking back on frustrations and difficulties, we'll say, had I only known. Well, I've said that. And who doesn't want to understand people and situations better? Who doesn't want to prevent difficulties and conflict? But when it's not possible, maybe it's time to ask the Lord to give us a fresh perspective. Lord, how do I respond to this? What's the message here? How do I move on after this? When we engage the Lord in a sincere way, or at least when I have, I see his benefits just automatically follow me. It's almost like a type of first aid relief, and it helps balance out the difficulties in life. John Paul, a couple months before he was gone from us, he read Psalm 103 every single night, out loud, over and over and over again. He always believed there was more. He always was checking his heart to see, what soul blockages are there? Is there anything going on that's going to interfere with this? But my sister and I had posted scriptures all over the house, and he heard me saying it out loud, and he said, oh, I say that every night out loud. Well, I had heard him, but, I kind of left him, for that private time with him and the Lord. When I think of prevention, I remember my grandfather. He'd sit in his easy chair in our house, and he had this little book called Prevention. It was all about health issues. And so that led me to remember the narrow shelf that lined our basement wall as you walk downstairs, full of vitamins. Well, after he passed, my grandmother looked at those vitamins and said to my brother, well, a lot of good those did him. And she said, throw them all away. Well, those vitamins may have done him some good, but she didn't understand, what the limitations were with them. And as much as we want to, we cannot prevent every tragedy, every mishap, or unpleasant situation in life. God doesn't allow it. He doesn't even want us to feel in control all the time. And why? Well, we count on our ability more than trust God and give him credit, don't we? And some of us, I don't know who that would be. Some of us need to let go of the perfectionist mentality and attitude, or you beat yourself up with guilt. So try not to do that to yourself. If we spend too much time on prevention, and you've heard this before too, we do what? We're hanging out in the past of the what ifs, rather than focusing on now and living in the moment. Or we might totally lose sight of, what's coming down the pike, so to speak, or what lays ahead of us in the future. No one is expected to enjoy distress or suffering. It used to always mystify me when you would see funerals of high-profile people in the media. It's almost like they were standing there waiting for the spouse to break down and cry. And it's like, why want somebody to feel sad when it's time for me to go? Why can't we just let people cry and grieve and be sad? But and of course we get to be experts at hiding our pain. But you know who we can't hide it from, and that's the Lord. But the flip side of suffering, pain, grief, it becomes a driving force to serve others. And you also understand on a much deeper level than you ever did, or that other people don't have the capacity, to understand unless God shows them. So whether you're suffering from pain of your past or you're on the mend from a more recent pain, you're going to be reinvented. It's inevitable. Whenever you have intense grief and suffering, you are going to become a different person in a way after that. But it's a prime time to be crowned with love and compassion, like it speaks of in Psalms. You might even look in the mirror one day and say, "Who is this?" And you begin doing things you never would have done before. You're more willing to reach out, maybe not procrastinate if that's your tendency, when God highlights someone to you. Now, on a practical side, preventative measures can be pretty valuable, and I've seen them to be a great stress reliever if tragedy does come knocking on your door. And I know you're going to say, "Ooh, this is a heavy topic to talk about." And I'm not saying to live like you're dying, but you'll do yourself a huge favor if you do spend some time thinking about and dealing with end-of-life issues. And the younger you are, the less you're going to think this matters. But it's really worth considering. My experience is that people outside of ministry will give more thought to this and more attention and some form of planning. And if you're not a detailed person, this area might be a good area to become one. People in ministry need to know the current laws for nonprofit organizations. You want to eliminate false assumptions and confusion. And of course, everyone's situation can be different. Some people are in a much more complicated situation. But individuals do not own a ministry. They don't inherit ministry assets or income, no matter how large or small. But learn what you can now and help reduce anxiety. Because when stress is at an all-time high, you need as much on-the-ground peace as possible by having something thought through or worked out. And don't even take your friend's word for how it works. Don't even follow some big ministry guideline. Not even, you have to almost do your own homework. Get a book on the latest guidelines. Make sure you're keeping up with regulations. And we do know they change, and they will be changing a lot more in the future. So keep abreast of it. So it's obvious loss brings hardship and changes, and people can be greatly, greatly affected. Whether you lose a person, a relationship, a house, your income, your job, even a pet can be devastating for some people. But I like to see the Lord as just crying with us sometimes, just a form of comfort. And so I'm going to emphasize this again. Friends and community are key. And if your friends and family are long distance, or you live in a remote area or by yourself, it could potentially be much, much more difficult for you. So keep that in mind and speak up for help. Don't wait for people to come to you. So we know that life is filled with many, many ministry opportunities, and we have to step up and claim some of those. Some of them don't take very much effort. I can drive around Fort Worth, and the first month I was there, I tell people I had 5 to 6 beggars approach me, and anyone else I talked to, they said, no, we don't encounter that. I was in a parking garage, and I ended up praying for a woman with this graphic story of her granddaughter stabbing her mother, and should she call child services? And it was night, and I went there to exercise, but I thought, I do believe this was a little assignment that God had waiting for me. Of course, I kept my eyes open as I prayed for her, and made sure nothing, was going to happen. But just driving down the freeways is accident after accident. And, we can get to the place to where it's like, oh, yeah, that's just commonplace. But hey, that's an opportunity for us to stop and pray. There's lives there. Take a moment to think beyond where you're going and what you're doing. And of course, I go back to I'm always convinced that God is working behind the scenes. He's standing by ready, and sometimes he's just waiting to hear on us. The last 5 years have been especially easy for me to give God the credit for going the distance with me. So I've gotten into the habit of thanking him every day, even for the little things. And going back in time, I can see how the Lord helped me weather life long before I knew he was ever even looking in on me. When we're young, either in age or in the spirit, we can't even imagine what good can pain and suffering benefit anyone. We just want to get away from the source of the pain. As leaders, especially seasoned leaders, we're more aware of how pain can debilitate you sometimes and the importance of facing it, so it doesn't build up like a dormant volcano or have you retreating behind a brick wall that no one can get through. If we allow the Lord to be part of the solution, he helps us move forward. In spite of sadness, he'll help you reestablish your energy. He may begin redirecting your attention, further beyond your world and things that just concern your day in and day out existence. I discovered the Lord not only wanted to be more involved with me, he was actually prearranging and arranging benefits for me all along. Imagine that, right? Well, surprise comes through people sometimes. And my roommate is an example of that, the great young gal who I live with. I have a young pastor who's connecting with me and extended, his help and support to me. He's another example how God was prearranging things ahead of time, for where I am today. And of course, there are other tangible and spiritual benefits. It required me seeking them out and finding them. And so we can either look back on life markers and events with the attitude of, where was God? Or we might say, hey, Lord, I really believe you're arranging and prearranging things for me and for others. When we allow God to take charge, he stakes his claim on us more than anyone. And it frees God to use us in any way he wants within his justice system. Can't you see John Paul saying that? And the enemy, of course, wants to keep us tethered to our pain. That pole with the ball and the rope. And that's not what we want. Sometimes we can even feel like we've lost, but the Lord is always cheering us on and saying, look ahead, look ahead. So we remember the big picture. It's not about me. We're on the way to God's grand finale. And along the way, he's going to point specific people out to us to consider. But then he's going to point us out to people, and they're going to consider us as well. So please think about that when you listen to events in my life, which I'll try to go through quickly when I get to it. But the Lord stuck with me. He was working behind the scenes, and people stepped up to make a claim and help at times. So I grouped and labeled life markers and events. Contentment, favor, influence, and that can be good or bad. Hardship, suffering, and trauma. Separation, transition, and recovery, discovery, and transformation. So here we go. My life kicked off with one of those infant seizures, where the thermometer is over 107 degrees. You can't tell exactly how high your temperature really is. And my mother was home alone with 3 babies. I have a twin sister. And in her words, she said I was making a god-awful sound. And she went rushing into the bedroom and found me thrashing around on the bed. Well, I recovered from that, but I did end up with permanent hearing loss, which I've had to deal with my whole life. And then, as you heard, I have a great twin sister, and I'll tell you what, when it comes to prayer, you want that gal in your corner. And when we were infants, my mother arranged for my sister and I to be taken care of by my grandparents. So the trip from Texas to Detroit ended the relationship with my birth father. It also meant a temporary separation from my sister and mother, or actually my brother and mother, for a year and a half. And then I had years of contentment living with my very devoted grandparents. But my grandmother, as sweet as she was, she practiced witchcraft. Now, the church didn't understand that back then. No grid for it whatsoever. They couldn't figure out, what to do with her ability to interact with the spirit world and her revelation. So she went her own way. During the same time, I felt somewhat of an emotional separation from my mother. I called her kind of my part-time mother. But even as a child, I could see how weighed down she was with rejection, which I didn't know to call it that then, and addictions. And at 10 years old, my siblings and I were abruptly removed from my grandparents' house. It was late one night, and we left the warmth and security behind, and we entered into years of a world of violence. Our entire family suffered at the hands of one bully, one abusive man, and it was the harsh reality of bad things happening to good people. And then you see how difficult it can be to watch other people suffer. So then there was a time of recovery. I lived with guardianship parents for a while before college. They took in a family of young women, each with their own struggles. It felt like a military school schedule. They had separate housing for girls and women from off the streets who they would gain custody through the courts to take them into their nonprofit organization. But this began a time of permanent separation from my brother and my mother, and this was the second time around as a 14-year-old. I then became a long-distance half-sister to 2 young siblings who were born after I left home. I had the misfortune to witness a Christian leader take advantage of women they were entrusted to protect. I then was restored to a budding relationship with my birth father at 20 years old. He had his own private plane. He was a successful Texas attorney, and I met him, the summer before my junior year of college. So now I'm transitioning to the new role of a daughter. I caught up with his family history, the string of 5 wives, and a lot more half-siblings. I had 2 education degrees, but very limited knowledge of the Bible or spiritual things. But I ended up discovering you can't always follow your heart. God just might have something else in store. So I broke up with my first fiance. And then love was in the air. It was a time of contentment after I met John Paul. We found each other, And he wasn't too happy when I put marriage on hold to get that master's degree. But then, very soon afterwards, I was stunned by my father's death. He entered my life at 20 years old, and he was gone by the time I was 23. He was flying his plane from Texas to Florida. He was going to give my sister away on her wedding day. His plane was torn apart by sheer winds, flying over Alabama. We lost an 8-year-old half-brother that day, too, who sat beside him. My stepmother and the girls, they were driving to Florida, but Kevin sat beside my father on that plane. Now, yes, John Paul was my husband-to-be, and he stood with me as we heard the tragic news. But as sad as that sounds, it's an example of God working behind the scenes to justify that accident. It was years later when I found out that my father had recommitted his life to the Lord within weeks of that accident. And God used an 80-plus-year-old blind woman, a friend of my grandmother, to share that story with me and encourage me. So isn't that beautiful? So then I transitioned to wife and being a long-distance stepmother to a darling stepson who John Paul had through an earlier marriage. John Paul traveled excessively, both in business and when he was in ministry. Our first year, he was gone 75% of the time. Second year, he was gone 50% of the time. We struggled with hardships of early marriage conflicts. I lost my grandfather that first year. He was a quiet little Italian, but he was the only father figure who I'd known or had some consistency with. Then we transitioned to a short time of my grandmother living with us. And as kind and gentle as she was, there was the tension of the dark spirits in her kind of coming up against the soul battle that John Paul and I were going through on our own. Well, after about 5 years of marriage, I got to watch the transformation of John Paul Jackson. God paid him a really special visit one day. He told him all about his future call, his future purpose. I began to discover more significance to dreams I'd had ever since I was a little girl. I used to tell people it was like my nighttime of, plays and acting out on a stage because I just remembered dreams so vividly. There was a beginning shift in our roles as I continued to work, and lots of transition in ministry, people with moving. We moved about 30 times, house to house and state to state. I watched my husband recover from leader reactions to a new young prophetic voice. He was just trying to contribute to the church. We were quietly booted from the first church. The second church, there was just no place for him. It was a growing, thriving church. They had a great model of the Lord's Prayer and really highlighted salvation. The next church, he thought, sure, he'd found his brotherhood and people he could serve long term with. But then we were reassigned. So he faced more rejection just because it wasn't meant to be. So I transitioned to being a supportive granddaughter to a grandmother I barely knew during that time. I was flying back and forth from Kansas City to Houston, taking care of my grandmother during her final years with dementia. For years, many long years, I was very content with intense homeschooling. If you knew what I did, you would say, yes, she did that. My son had learning challenges and Tourette syndrome, and I watched a child experience rejection. I watched the further processing and transformation in my husband. He was publicly and falsely accused of prophetic wrongdoing. We learned to be content, regardless of our status or our church demand. So the time came for him to set up his independent ministry. The church simply didn't know what to do with my guy. I then was in a severe head-on automobile accident. And this is another picture of God speaking, and behind the scenes what's going on. Both my sister and I, independent from each other, had a knowing, and we began praying for what was about to go down, for my protection. So, yes, I recovered, but then you go on with years of dealing with insurance claims. So we transitioned from growing ministry organization to a paring down and then expanding influence again. We faced the tragedy of an accidental death related to a staff member. And probably most of you and most people in ministry have faced times of people close to you pulling away. And I find that so grievous on many levels. But it's part of the risk when you love and you completely trust. But it's a risk worth taking. Sometimes people make deliberate choices more than mistakes, and trust issues would damage long-term relationships. So I see that as a loss to the kingdom, like a setback. When people look out for themselves at the expense of a ministry and create their own list of benefits, maybe listen to their own counsel too much, you can end up with alliances weakening. I call it as the troops disperse. And then the really sad part is watching the damage to third-party relationships, innocent people, and they lose out on future influence. And yes, we must forgive and move on, but sadly, sometimes resentment and false judgments cause people to delay restoration. And in some cases, you lose the opportunity for that to ever take place as it slips away. After moving back to Texas from New Hampshire, I believe this was the third time back, we ended up in a period of time with what they call life's most impacting stressors. And it was one after the other after the other. There were years of ongoing legal issues. We moved our disabled in-laws in with us. They were precious, but they needed 24-hour care. We buried my mother-in-law. We buried my father-in-law. And it was difficult to even watch them in the years, of their physical decline. And I thought I never would recover from a home restoration we did, where our outdoor property of 2 acres was destroyed by a really strong hailstorm and wind. And our inside, we had a 50-gallon slow leak in a water tank that penetrated the slab, so we had to gut the entire first level of our home. Well, we had nearly a year reprieve from major stress, and then we discovered my husband had 4th-stage terminal cancer. There was the trauma of fighting for his life. We felt the pain trying to be supportive parents to our adult son, who was going through the first of 2 relationship failures. My mother in Detroit passed away a short time after she became ill, and it was heartbreaking when I couldn't leave my husband to go be with her because I was taking care of him. So less than 3 months later, and my husband was also gone. So I transitioned to early widowhood. I watched my long-distance stepson lose both his dads to cancer in less than a year. I transitioned to living alone and selling my home. Added to that was the chaos, and for me, a type of trauma when we were dismantling the ministry and it went through reconstruction. And John Thomas knows I'm for him and has nothing to do with him. He's great. But everything felt like absolutely everything disappeared from my life. Wasn't the same anymore. I discovered the hardship of being a single parent to adult children. My youngest son struggled with life and was really in need of a father's counsel. I transitioned to finding a home and living out of storage and even feeling at home again. But a big lesson I learned, you can't gauge ministry value, your impact, even God's favor according to your struggles and hardships in life. We may not see exactly how God is playing the winning hand, But he takes the least desirable times of our life and he can create something delightful to benefit someone else. You know, Psalm 89, David caught God's attention. And we need more Davids. We need more Abigails. We need to support people like that, the Joshuas, the Marys, the Esthers. But then there's the weaker in spirit, those who are going to go through times of devastation and heartbreak. We need to encourage and cheer people on. Be there and help them with their learning curve. I like what God said about David. I have found my servant David, with whom my hand shall be established. Also my arm shall strengthen him. The enemy shall not outwit him, but my faithfulness and my mercy shall be with him. Always consider there may be unclaimed benefit that you have yet to discover. Don't question that God isn't for you after a tragic event or something unfortunate and unexpected. Watch how God turns the dark times in our lives into light for the benefit of someone else. The hardest blow in my life encouraged me and motivated me to strengthen friendship, strengthen myself physically and emotionally. It pushed me to dive deeper into discovering and figure out God and me together. Sure, I've been disappointed, but the Lord has never let me down. And I found he hid me and he sought me out, both at the same time. Life around me seemed to spin out of control, but God didn't change. Not all future secrets of our life are going to be revealed to us, but I do know the Lord's in it for the long haul with us. If we saw everything coming ahead, what? Some of us would live in prevention mode. I'd be there. Others would try to interfere with God's intent. That would have been John Paul. And as hard as life can be, we have to realize there's a life beyond our comfort, in our cushy little existence. You have to rise above those knockout punches of life. They can really throw you off balance for a while. So when your real life dream plays out, it's time to do what? Pick yourself up, dust yourself off. And I think it's plenty okay to even pick ministry up and put it back down again, but don't ever create a habit of putting the Lord up and putting him back down. And never, ever believe the enemy is working harder for you than God is working for you. I can see John Paul saying that, maybe he did. There will be faithful people who will go the distance with you. God gives us a choice whether we want to finish our life with a sigh, so to speak. But find those who need your influence, and you'll have no trouble finding a place to minister or someone to minister to. If we stay passionate about the Lord's heart for us, that's where we grant him more access to places in our heart. And he's made it very clear to me, he is definitely after my heart. And that's where I see God's magic happen. He steers us to things that matter to him more than to us. Bob Jones predicted my husband would finish strong. And the Lord is looking for people to finish strong. So I encourage you to look for people who will go the distance with you. Tap into God and his benefit, and consider being available for the long haul. Don't settle for hiding your impact. It's okay to even hide in plain sight. I can get pretty good at that. No matter what your circle of influence. We need devoted husbands, wives, and grandparents to children more than ever. We need sons and daughters to help aging parents and adult children. There's nothing wrong with being content to be grandparents and parents, but you might just hear the Lord whisper to you, hey, are you available? There's still more you can do. And if we shine in our family role, it better prepares us to shine in a ministry capacity. And yeah, we can hide from people, but we definitely can't hide from God. I've found out he wins at the game of hide and seek every time. And like David, he will find you if he wants you. So don't stop expecting God to be God. And watch him encourage you to help other people, even when life hurts. I see God as like an internal medicine specialist, and he keeps us living and moving and having our being in him. So when you feel like you've just crawled out of the trenches or maybe even out of a pit, the Lord just might slowly start moving you forward. And then you may get really surprised as you see yourself pick up speed. But he wants you to fly with him and maybe even have some fun along the way. So whether you're in a time of solo journey, whether you have a steady companion, or even blessed in a family setting, spread your wings and fly. You know, I kind of like the thought of looking at things from God's viewpoint, you know, a higher way of thinking, you know, expanding our scope of vision beyond us. Find someone who needs to hear from you. And when you do, you just might become someone's hero. Now, I've had heroes come into my life. And when you do have one cross your path, be sure to take time and say thank you. It doesn't take a mighty warrior to be a hero. It just requires we keep showing up and making ourselves available during and after life hurts. And I imagine you're probably here because you've chosen to be available. So stick with God. You know, find people who will go the distance with you. And then what do? We want to freely give as we've been freely given to. So God bless all you all. And it's always fun seeing people I haven't seen in a while. And I love meeting new people. So God bless you. He wants me to pray for you. I'm going to pretend like I'm big and tall. Dear Lord, I know you're hovering over us. I don't doubt that your eyes are upon everyone here, and you can see into the crevices of their heart. You know exactly where they are with you. You know exactly what they need. You know what will encourage them to keep moving forward in you and go forward and search out new things. Thank you, Lord, for the opportunity that you've given us to mesh with you and to mesh with each other. And I ask that this be a people that don't give up on you, that don't give up on each other, that they go forth and they finish strong and they are content to do what you inspire them to do, not what necessarily someone else does. Help them to find what you have for them to do. We ask for protection on them as they travel home. Thank you so much for people with a heart after you.
Amen. Amen. Good. Oh, praise God.